Okay, what's the difference between a conspiracy theory and not a conspiracy theory? Well, about 8 to 10 months, it would seem. All right, so we're well over a year into this health crisis, and we've seen a lot of things come and go, a lot of ups and downs. Thankfully now, we seem to have a handle on it. The vaccines are there, they're rolling out, and large parts of the populations, certainly in the West and the United States and all the, if you like, developed countries, are becoming inoculated very fast. So hopefully this is, we're on the back straight now. But over the past year, you've probably seen headlines like, like this. Or possibly this. Or even maybe this. So very early on, the big question was, how could it happen? Where did it come from? What's behind it? How could such a thing just appear out of the ether and affect the whole world? Well, there was different ideas floating around. The main idea that got, if you like, traction or got pushed, or whatever way you want to look at, was the whole fish market thing. The fish market, the wet market, whatever they call them, in Wuhan. Nobody disputed that it appeared first or got going in the Chinese city of Wuhan. That was beyond doubt. And the most accepted, if you will, theory was that it came from bats, and it somehow, this wet market was the epicenter of it, and somehow the virus leaped from bats to humans, and then the whole thing got going. And this was pretty much the accepted, if you like, version. Now, there was other ideas floating around, one of which, the main one, if you like, was that it came from a viral lab, or a virology lab, or a whatever, this high-powered virus institute, or Institute of Immunology or Virology or something, that was just up the road, whose business it was to be dicking around with viruses, just like that one. No, said the mainstream media, that's all nonsense. That's conspiracy theory. And of course then Trump came out and said he'd seen some intel reports that led to that possibility being quite a possibility. And of course, once he said it, that well, that was the end of that. It was obviously crackpot territory. Now, of course, the Chinese were all over this like a rash. In fact, they managed to cow the whole world's media into pretty much radio silence over even calling it the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus. They managed to shut everybody up about that. You couldn't even cut. Now, side note, nobody seems to have a problem calling it the Indian variant, or the Brazilian variant, or the South African variant. Nobody seems to have any issue with that. But the Chinese are very, very precious about these things. So they basically got the whole world's media en masse to stop calling it anything to do with China. So it then became COVID-19, the name you'll all know and love. So, all right, so that was the whole idea that it might have come from a lab was kicked into the touch, into the long grass. Only people who howl at the moon would think that or say that. In fact, big tech went out of its way to silence anybody who even brought it up, mentioned it, wrote an article about it, made a video about it, like this one. Big tech basically ruled that whole theory, that whole idea, as out of play, not to be discussed, not to be talked about. Okay, when you're into censorship like that, I always get a little bit curious. So I went digging around, you know, turning over rocks and stuff to see what I could find. And I found this article, a very interesting article. It's from a site that I haven't heard of before. Assuming it's been going quite a long time. And it's an article from last year. It's an article from March 2020. And I thought I'd go through it with you because just recently, in the last few days, our big tech overlords, the purveyors of truth and what you can and can't say, because Lord knows we couldn't think for ourselves, they have now had to roll back, Facebook in particular, on the discussion of this possible lab leak theory. Seemingly now it's no longer a conspiracy theory, it's an actual real live possibility, they're admitting. There you go. So what was a year ago complete howl at the moon conspiracy is now being talked about as a very real live possibility. Even Dr. Fauci and all the usual suspects who would have poo-pooed it a year ago are having to come out and say, well, maybe it's possible. So Facebook has had to roll back and say, listen, we'll no longer stop you talking about that. We no longer think it's a conspiracy theory. If you want to talk about it, we will let you. How magnanimous. Our friends in big tech. Anyway, going back to the thing. So I found this article here, and it's from a website called Listverse. I think what they do is, I don't know much about these guys, but I do find this article really interesting. They kind of do compile lists of top 10 this and top 10 that, but here you go, from last year, right? This is a year old, this is March, over a year old, March 2020. Around the time this was really all catching fire, and around the time that this was literally becoming the theory that dare not speak its name. But I think it's worth reading because some interesting stuff on this, and now that we are allowed to talk about it, thanks big tech, we will talk about it. Top 10 reasons to believe the Wuhan Virology Lab caused the 2019 coup. By Mark Oliver, fact checked by Jamie Frater. Don't know who these lads are, you can look them up if you want. If you don't want, then don't bother your arse. Now, quote, it's a quote, "We are not just battling the virus, but also conspiracy theories," end quote. A spokesman for the Wuhan Institute of Virology has said. Conspiracy theories do nothing but create fear, rumours and prejudice. Yes, because it was very quickly branded by the Chinese Communist Party that anybody who in any way questioned the Chinese authorities and their scientists and their labs was obviously a racist. You see how this works? You know how this works. Anyway, we'll go on. Top 10 mysterious viruses. He was trying to squash an idea even, that has been growing in popularity ever since the outbreak. That his virology lab at the heart of Wuhan might be responsible. Look, if I'm on the street and I see an extremely drunk man, let's say, person if you want, out of his bin, and he's on the street and he's just a few yards up from the pub. Now, I'm going to make that leap of logic that maybe he was in the pub. I can't prove he was in the pub, but I'm going to lean towards maybe he was in the pub for a while. That's just me. That's just how my mind works. So when this whole thing was exploding, and it just happened to break out literally across the street from a virology lab that by sheer coincidence was dicking around with bat viruses. I don't know. You know, you see the drunk guy in the street, the pub is there. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Anyway, let's go back to list verse here. Right, so he was trying to squash this rumour, of course. The Chinese were literally tying themselves in knots over this. In a way, he was right. In a time of crisis, the article goes on, the last thing anyone would want to do is spread fear. None of us knew what this was or what it could do or how it would go. This is a year ago, March. Especially if it's based on nothing but a baseless rumour. But when you start looking into those claims, that the epidemic that's already infected, well, that's a year old, so don't mind that, started in a Wuhan virology lab, it starts looking like something other than a conspiracy theory. It starts looking like an explanation that holds up unnervingly well. And that, if we take time to look into it, could help prevent something similar from happening again. Alright, there you go, number 10. It's 10 reasons. Right, the official story is, we all know this, that it started in a seafood market in Wuhan. Unclean animals were sold there carrying the virus. Alright, you've heard that. Chinese scientists have suggested, and as a result, some unlucky shoppers ended up becoming patient zeros for a global crisis. They were in there and they were buying their bats and stuff, and you know how the story goes. You've probably already heard that explanation before, and there's a good chance you've accepted it as fact. But there are some glaring problems with it. For one thing, the first patients with COVID-19 have no connection to the market whatsoever. They lived nearby and they appear to have spread the disease to people who went there. Not the other way around. But the real patient zeros never actually stepped foot inside of it. And here's another little tidbit for you if you've been paying attention. In the last few days, it has come to light, and verifiably come to light, that as early, I think, as November of 19, a couple of Chinese researchers from that lab were taken to hospital with what seems to be COVID symptoms in November. So before any of this even kicked off. Yeah, wet market me arse. Okay, also, the article goes on, also in 2019, COVID is believed to have originated in bats, and this was a seafood market. Nobody was selling bats inside of this market. Bats just aren't something people in Wuhan normally eat. Okay, why does nobody dig this stuff up? Oh yeah, because, China. Even China's scientists have started backing away from this theory. To quote one directly, quote, "It seems clear that the seafood market is not the only origin of the virus. But to be honest, we still do not know where the virus came from." A lot of people have pointed out to the Wuhan Institute. A lot of people have pointed to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is just a 30-minute drive from the seafood market. But if that's not close enough for you, there's another lab that researches bat coronavirus that's even closer. The Wuhan Center for Disease Control and Prevention. It's not just on the other side of town, it's on the other side of the street. Is it just me? Does anybody? No. Right, number 9. The Wuhan Virology Lab was studying bat coronaviruses. Okay, a couple of nice pictures of the lab there. Let's go on with the article. The Wuhan Center for Disease Control and Prevention isn't just an administrative office. Scientists were inside that building actively conducting research, including studies on coronaviruses in bats. A lot of researchers in Wuhan were. It had been a major project for the city, and the Wuhan Institute of Virology took great pride in this. They were at the forefront in researching the causes of SARS, and it was their researchers who had proven that the last SARS outbreak originated in bats. They had to look at an awful lot of sick bats to do it though. Researchers had been gathering bats infected with the coronavirus since at least 2012. And they were focusing on ones that could spread their illness to human beings. So, I don't know about you, but any of this suspicious? No? Are your spidey senses tingling? The article goes on. There were hundreds of bats in Wuhan's labs when the COVID outbreak started, and the researchers were studying at least 11 new strains of SARS-related viruses in them. And yes, they were doing it across the street from the place where the outbreak started. Suspicious? Number 8. 2019 Cove is a 96% match for a bat virus in the Wuhan virology lab. There's a lad collecting a few bats there. So what else would you be doing on a Saturday afternoon? Probably had a few beers after it. Now, let's go on. The coronavirus that's spreading around the world at this very moment has been called novel because it's unique. It's different from past diseases like SARS, about 30% different, to be exact. That's not just a number we pulled out of our heads. Scientists have compared the genetic sequence of SARS to COVID-19, and they found that they're about 70% similar. That's a rough number. The real one might be a bit higher, but the real number probably isn't 96%, which is the percentage match scientists have found between the COVID-19 and a form of the coronavirus carried by bats inside the Wuhan Institute of Virology. 96% match. Quote, but wait a minute, if you say, if those bats had the virus, they were probably bats all around Wuhan that had it, right? Afraid not. COVID-19 isn't just similar to bat coronaviruses in general, it's similar to a very specific strain of bat coronavirus carried by bats in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. It was specific to the bats they had in the lab, not the ones flying around the place, landing on your car or your window at night. No, nothing to do with those. This was the ones that they were dicking around with this virus. And what got out was a 96% match for what they had been, for the dicking around they'd been doing. It matched what was in the lab, not what was outside it. In fact, the article goes on, when another lab conferred COVID-19 to their own bats, the closest match they could find was 88%. So it was specific, not to labs in general around China, but to the Wuhan lab. And those bats weren't local. If you were living in Wuhan and you really wanted to find one of those bats, you'd either have to go to the virology lab or to the place those bats had come from, Yunnan and Zhejiang. That's a little over 900 kilometers away. Now, I don't know a lot about bats, but I don't think they can fly that far. Number 7, an infected bat bled on a researcher shortly before the outbreak. Okay, let's have a look at number 7. Okay, so a disease, the article says, so a lab was researching these diseases. So what? That doesn't prove that it ever got out, right? While it's unlikely that the Wuhan Institute of Virology deliberately it's highly unlikely that the Wuhan Institute of Virology deliberately plagued its own people, it really wouldn't have been that hard for somebody to catch it by accident. Imagine if a bat attacked a researcher and, in the chaos, spilled its blood onto his bare skin. Or imagine if he got a bit too close and bat urine got in his body. Or imagine if both those things happened to the same person not long before the outbreak began. That's exactly what happened, according to the article. According to a report by Chinese researchers Bo Tao and Lei Zhao, excuse my Chinese there, it's not my first language, a researcher named Junhua Tian described these exact experiences in an interview with Changjiang Times. Don't read it, I'm sure it's great. Junhua Tian claims he quarantined himself to keep from spreading this disease. But even if he and his colleagues used every possible precaution, it's possible that the virus still could have leaked out. But one thing we have learned since the outbreak is that people can show no symptoms at all and still be infected. And according to a recent study out of Japan, people who have recovered can still carry the virus. Okay. Number 6, SARS escaped from a Beijing lab twice. Yeah, I've heard this before from some people who are in the scientific community and have worked with Chinese interns or whatever. It seems to be a thing with the Chinese. They might have all the protocols and the rules and whatever, but they're just not very good at sticking to them, which is not a great kind of method to have if you're dealing with something like COVID viruses, I would think. All right, let's go on. Of course, it's also possible that the staff at the Wuhan Institute of Virology just didn't use every possible precaution. It wouldn't be the first time somebody's walked out of a Chinese virology lab carrying a deadly sickness. It's happened before. In fact, it happened twice in a single month. That's not heartening. On April the 4th, 2004, a postgraduate student working at a virology lab in Beijing was diagnosed with SARS. She'd gotten infected while researching the virus, and, unaware that she was sick, walked out into the public and very nearly caused a second outbreak. Yeah, you see how this can happen if you're not careful. That's why these protocols in these high-level labs have to be so strict. You can't just put your coat on and say, listen, I'm just going for a sandwich, I'll be back in a minute. Can't do that. You cannot do that. Let's go on. That's pretty bad, but what makes it downright terrifying is that 2 weeks later, another postgrad student working at the exact same lab did the exact same thing. How? How can that happen? How can something like... It shouldn't even be possible that that can happen, but in China, it seems that it is possible. All right. That's not just negligent, according to scientist Antoine Danshin. It should technically be impossible. Quote, normally it's not possible to contaminate people even under level 2 confinement, if the security rules are obeyed. I think the Wuhan lab was level 4 or something. Could be mistaken. So it was top level anyway. So he says it shouldn't even be able to happen under a level 2 lab. Never mind level 4. So something has gone wrong. He goes on to quote, the lab might have all the right rules, but the people may not comply. Number 5. The Wuhan Virology Lab was testing a virus that matches COVID-19. In case there was any doubt, the Wuhan Institute definitely had postgrad students on its staff. We can confirm that because in November 18 of 2019, shortly before the breakout, the Institute put up a job posting asking for postgraduate students to help study the coronavirus in humans and bats. Okay, that's not exactly out of the ordinary, but the description in the job posting is a little disturbing. It says that they were particularly interested in molecular mechanisms that let coronavirus lie dormant for a long time without symptoms. Sound familiar? That's one of the distinguishing traits of COVID-19. The fact that people can go around without any apparent symptoms and still spread it. Well, now we all know that. That's just been a whole part of the thing that you didn't even know you had it. 322 of the people on the Diamond Princess cruise ship tested positive without symptoms. And there's proof that those asymptomatic people can spread the disease. In fact, one woman is confirmed to have spread it to at least 5 people without showing any symptoms of her own. Number 4, researchers at the lab had recently created a new coronavirus. The staff at Wuhan didn't just work on cures. They also spent some time developing new superviruses of their own. In 2015, 2 researchers at the Institute participated in an international experiment led by American scientist Ralph Baric. The goal? Create a new coronavirus with the ability to infect human beings. This is crazy stuff. If that sounds like a weird goal to you, you're not alone. A significant part of the scientific community was outraged by this experiment. I'm outraged by this experiment. The only impact of his work is the creation in a lab of a new non-natural risk, biologist Richard Ebert protested when the work came out. French virologist Simon Wayne Hobson agreed. If the virus escaped, he warned, nobody could predict the trajectory. Nobody indeed. Could we be living the aftermath of something like that? Number 3, 2019 COVID has eerie similarities to HIV. Haven't heard this one before. According to a controversial study out of India, some aspects of COVID-19 have quote, uncanny similarities to HIV. Full disclosure, this study's gotten a fair degree of scrutiny. Some scientists have questioned whether it used enough data to be statistically significant, and they've put it through the ringer enough that at this point the study's authors have withdrawn their work. But while their work might be unproven, that doesn't necessarily make it wrong, and there's a little bit of evidence to back it up. HIV drugs are proving to be remarkably effective in treating the drug, and most patients are showing low white blood cell counts, something that doesn't happen with any other form of coronavirus. That's creepy, says the article, and I think it is. Number 2. The Communist Chinese government ordered silence, and they very, very much did, with the compliance of a lot of the West's media and big tech, our friends. Infectious disease, the article goes on to say, specialist Daniel Lucy got the chance to review the documents and data China had in its possession when the cove broke out, and he came out of it baffled. Their official story, he said, just didn't make any sense. China must have realised the epidemic did not originate. This is a quote from Daniel Lucy. China must have realised the epidemic did not originate in that Wuhan seafood market, Lucy told the press. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps somebody in Wuhan knew that the story didn't add up, even when they first announced it. But if they did, they were under strict orders not to say anything about it. On January 2nd, 2020, the day after the Wuhan seafood market was blamed for the disease, the Wuhan Institute of Virology sent out a disclosure strictly, quote, prohibiting disclosure of information on COVID-19. Some scientists have spoken up anyway. A good part of this article, for example, draws from a study by the National Natural Science Foundation of China called The Possible Origins of COVID-19 Coronavirus. It might not surprise you to find out, shortly after that study was released, that the communist government did its best to pull it off the internet, with as much vigour as they are using in attempting to stop people to referring to the virus as the Chinese virus or the Wuhan flu. And they did manage to cut that down. In fact, they managed to cut it out. We now know nobody calls it those things because big tech, the mainstream media, banned those terms. Nobody used those terms after the first few weeks. It just shows you, if ever you were in any doubt, of the power of the Chinese machine. Alright, number 1. The Chinese government is tightening up the biolab security. The biggest smoking gun of all of them came straight out of the mouth of President Xi Jinping. On February 14, this is last year, President Xi gave a speech on the need to contain the COVID. Chinese, he said, needs to learn our lessons so we can strengthen our areas of weaknesses and close the loopholes exposed by the epidemic. While Xi was never completely explicit about how those loopholes were to be closed, he did announce his plan to push through a new law for biosecurity at laboratories. Okay, why would he need to do that? Specifically, since it was nothing to do with the lab, why would he be needing to tighten up security there? One wonders. Specifically targeting the use of biological agents that, quote, may harm national security. The very next day, the Chinese Ministry of Science and Technology followed up on Xi's speech with a new directive entitled, quote, Instructions on Strengthening Biosecurity Management in Microbiology Labs that Handle Advanced Viruses like the Novel Coronavirus. There's only one microbiology lab in all of China that handles advanced viruses like the coronavirus. It's the Wuhan Institute of Virology. All right, interesting stuff. What do you make of that? What do you make of that? This is from March last year. This is from March last year. And articles like that, and talk like that, and chatter like that, and discussion like that were absolutely scrubbed. People were deplatformed, people were banned, people were called nuts, people were called conspiracy theorists for even talking about this. Like I said, you see a drunk guy staggering up the road and he's a few yards from a big pub. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm just saying, what are you supposed to, what conclusion does a normal person draw from that? These guys, let's call it what it is. These guys over in Wuhan were dicking around with bat viruses. They were dicking around with them for years. They were doing all kinds of things to them. They were trying to plug in new abilities to them. They were trying to change them, trying to adapt them. They were doing all kinds of things. And then something went wrong somewhere. And we're supposed to believe it had nothing to do with the lab that was dicking around with the virus. It was from that market, the seafood market across the road that didn't even sell bats. I'm sorry. It does. Look, you know, I'm sorry. It just doesn't add up. It doesn't add up. The Chinese are not exactly the most transparent regime in the world, and they have their tentacles into every major economy and minor economy on the planet now, and they cannot countenance any bad press. They cannot countenance any criticism. They can't. I'm reminded of an old saying: the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing you he didn't exist. Well, the Chinese are masters at convincing the world they're no threat. But this is, to my mind, a very worrying thing. They're dicking around with world-changing material here. As you've seen, the world has changed in a way nobody could have imagined. And is it due to the Chinese just not being vigilant enough, not being careful enough, not covering all the bases? Because they're in such a rush, or they just don't care, or they're just prepared to take risks that most other countries would never take? I don't know. I don't know. Maybe we'll never know. But there you go. Interesting article. Thought you might like it. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. But food for thought. So now that we can talk about it, we should talk about it. When is a conspiracy not a conspiracy?